Hello, and welcome to my vlog of Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. This is book 1 in the Tawny Man trilogy, and I don't typically do vlogs on my channel. This is not my typical content, but I wanted to offer my journey of this book because I heard it is quite emotional, that it explores trauma, themes related to trauma. You can't hear about this series without hearing the word trauma, and I wanted to see what I can offer in a spoiler-filled way. So there will be spoilers in this video, in this journey. And I also want to share, because this is me talking from the future, I've already finished the book. I haven't read the Farseer trilogy in 3+ years, so I'm very rusty based on my memories of what happened in that trilogy. And then I also just recently came off reading the Live Ship Traders trilogy. And one thing I forgot to mention in my first update is that it was an adjustment for me to go from third-person multi-POV narration to first-person narration with Fitz again. So much so that when I got to chapter 2, I had to take a moment and realize, oh, I'm still in Fitz's head. So it did take a little bit of an adjustment for me. I think I got into the flow of third-person multi-POV in that last trilogy. But that said, I did quickly adjust after that, and you will hear the results of my journey. So thank you for following along. So I'm about 10% through the book right now, and it's been a long time since I finished the Farseer trilogy, but I feel like Robin Hobb is doing an excellent job of recapping what happened in the original trilogy, since I think she understands that it might have been a while for some of her readers, especially with the Live Ship Traders in between. I'm catching up with Fitz in old age. He's living alone in the woods, or mostly alone. He's actually raising an orphan named Hap. And he also has Night Eyes with him, so he's not totally alone. But he's hiding out under the name Tom Batterlock. And that's when Shade comes to visit him. And it seems like everything in this story is pointing towards Fitz leaving this shack and going back to Buckkeep. But it seems like this cottage is his safety. He's in hiding, and he doesn't want to go back, even with the temptation of being able to see his daughter, his bastard daughter Nettle, and even with the temptation of getting to help train Prince Dutiful in the skill and just seeing Buckkeep again. And clearly he has memories and he's tempted, but he doesn't see the skill as anything that's worthwhile. He calls it some kind of disease, whereas Shade says that Fitz maybe didn't learn as much about the skill as he could have, that maybe there's more to the skill. But then again, it's like, if Fitz fell short on training, if there's more to the skill than he knew, then why ask him to train these young people? So it's interesting, just this offer, this opportunity that he of course turns down, and even just the interaction between him and Shade is beautiful. I think that there's clearly still a connection there. Oh, and I think the other thing that was interesting to me about this meeting with Shade is how Fitz is revealing how difficult it's been to have the skill and to suppress the urges that he feels, that he's been using elf bark to do that. And Shade says that he had no idea, that no one had any idea that he had been suffering, that he figured it would be much like any other addiction where after so much time, he would get over it. And Fitz says, no, it's not like that at all. It never goes away. There's so much story that happens at the beginning, so much exposition going back to the Piebald Prince and what we learn about the Witted. But I think more striking is when Starling returns, and we know that Starling and Fitz are still lovers after all this time. And we learn how she came back into his life. Oh, just the reveal, learning from Hap that Starling is married. And I couldn't help but think, good for you, Fitz, for asserting a boundary here, because I think it's so unfair. It's so unfair the way she expects him to just accept it, and she's not hurting anyone because her husband doesn't know. It's so awful the way she handles that. The part that spoke to me the most personally was when she was telling him that this is no life for him. This is not a life for anybody, for him to be living alone in a cottage in the woods with this orphan, what is it? She says, a decrepit wolf is the way she describes Night Eyes. And how in that moment, not only does he feel affronted by that, but he also takes into account how differently they perceive the world, how differently they see things, and that this is something that would have come about, it would have come to light had they lived together. But because they've had this long distance relationship, every meeting has just been like a honeymoon period for them, like an extended honeymoon period, because they haven't had the day-to-day practical matters come up for them, or the moments where they would reveal their true selves or their true feelings or their true values. Those things have never come to the surface because they've had this easygoing long distance thing. And I felt like I related to that as somebody who's been in long distance relationships before. It can be like an extended honeymoon period, because even if you have these deep conversations, which deeper conversations than they have had, clearly, even then, you still don't get the depth of a person. You still don't get the depth of what somebody values on a day-to-day basis or how that works in a real relationship until you're actually together on a daily basis, versus this long extended honeymoon period of a long distance relationship. And that's coming to light very clearly. And Fitz is clearly struggling with that when it comes to Starling. And I'm glad that he asserts a boundary there, because it's so unfair. So that's where I'm at right now. And I'll be back later for another update. Okay, so I want to go ahead and catch up to where I am, which has been a while. I'm now past the halfway point. Starling taking Hap on that trip was all in service to Shade. And I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable about that. Like, that she knew the whole entire reason for this, that there were all these other motives going on, all these other secrets that he wasn't privy to, that he didn't know about. And also the trust issues that Fitz already has. And she tells him that Shade tells her that you were incapable of completely trusting anyone, that wanting to trust and fearing to would always divide your soul. And so that division, that feeling of I want to trust, but I can't trust. I mean, I feel it so deeply. I feel it so deeply just going back to the Farseer trilogy and everything that Fitz has been through. And it makes sense, because at the end of the day, we all need trust. We all need connection, and where to find that. And I feel like trust is something that comes up again in this story. But my thought with that, with Starling saying that, is like, well, you're not helping. You're not helping with his trust issues by everything that you've kept from him, by two-timing him. Now going on to the head witch, Jenna. And as soon as I came across this character, I right away thought that there might be some romantic potential between Fitz and Jenna. And I also assumed that she would quickly figure out that he had the skill or the wit. I like the little details of their interactions, the way that he determines that her eyesight is poor, something I questioned. Is her eyesight really poor? But it's something that he notices right away, just these little tiny things, these little tiny ways that they interact, the subtlety of their interactions, I should say, and the way she checks in with his response after Hap offers hospitality to her, after he offers their cottage as a place for her to stop. We also learn in this part of the book that Hap was Raider-born, is how it's called, and that Starling said some horrible things to Hap, how he had the same forged heart as his raping father. And I guess she's pretty upset that Hap told Fitz about her husband. Horrible. And then Fitz says this line here, it doesn't matter who a man's father is. Your parents made a child, but it is up to you to make the man you'll be. Fitz later has a dream of being at a festival and drawing unwanted attention. And this, I feel, might be connected to something that we learn later on in the story. So Jenna visits, and there's a whole discussion about whether knowledge should or shouldn't be available to all. And this is in response to all the scrolls that Fitz has written. And I love this conversation. Like, do people need to earn knowledge, or is this something that should be disseminated widely? And it makes me think back to something I'd heard once about religious teaching, and how thousands of years ago, only the select few could have access to certain teachings or to certain types of information, whereas the masses were kept from certain information. I'm not a scholar on this topic, but it does make me curious about this and how it relates to that, like how this whole conversation is about you should be careful about who you share knowledge with, and that you make sure that they really understand the knowledge, that they're not getting haphazard information. so interesting as we are now in a world that is full of information around every corner, information overload, as many people say. And she reads his palms and she says that she's never seen two palms that were so unalike. And I suspect you wonder if you even know who you are yourself. There's also that spooked moment with that charm that warns off predators. And so he and Night Eyes get revealed in that moment, but she ends up leaving him in peace. She leaves him with this garden spell and talks about a love that is coming back into his life or weaving in and out of his life. And I wonder about that. Of course, his thoughts go to Molly. My thoughts wonder about the Fool. And the next section is the reunion with the Fool, which, oh my goodness, my heart was melting over this exchange between the Fool and Fitz. This reunion is so beautiful. The hug, the openness, the gesture, the way that Fitz opens his arms and the look in their eyes. It was so beautiful. And I think the Fool / Amber might be one of my favorite characters right now. I just adore the Fool. And I love how the mare is named Malta. We get a lot of interesting interactions between the two in this part of the book. Lots of backstory occurring in this part. Fitz goes into sharing where he's traveled since they last parted, and his encounter with the old blood folk and his education about the wit from Rolf. I really liked that section because something that I didn't feel comfortable about in the Farseer trilogy was how the bond between Night Eyes and Fitz was so entangled that when Fitz was intimate with Molly, that Night Eyes was there. It just it did not feel good to me. I was a little unsettled about their connection. And I like that Rolf was teaching him that is not okay. You two need to be much more separated than you are. So I appreciated some of what he learned and what he relays in this whole entire exchange. Of course, this comes up after Night Eyes nearly chokes on that fishbone, and that whole entire section was intense. That was probably the most intense thing that happens in the whole first half of the book, as far as action is concerned, I should say. And this whole fishbone scene speaks to a theme that I keep seeing over and over again in this first half of the story, and beautifully executed, beautifully explored. And that is the theme of boundaries. Of course, we have boundaries in terms of how the wit magic works, but also the skill in how Fitz intervenes to save Night Eyes against Night Eyes' will. Night Eyes doesn't want Fitz to use the skill on him, and he uses it anyway. And then the Fool uses it on Fitz to bring Fitz back, and Fitz feels violated. So there's a violation of boundaries, but there's also the understanding they had the best intentions. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people crossing boundaries with the best of intentions, but it's still feeling like a violation, and it's still hurting you, and it's still causing, I would say, some issues again with trust and boundaries that comes up over and over again. But in addition to that, I feel like we also get so much about boundaries, even the interactions that Fitz has with Shade, with Jenna especially being somebody who's very new to him, and just the little subtle movements of trust that happen when you feel like you're stepping a little too close and maybe you're not close enough, or trying to find that balance, that subtle dance that happens when you're getting to know somebody and trying to feel what's right and what's wrong, and how can we connect in a way that's comfortable for both of us and still opening and growing that connection. And it's so beautifully and powerfully executed with just perfect, subtle grace. I am amazed with the way that Hobb writes about that. The Fool and Fitz have fantastic conversations in this whole section. There's the discussion about Fitz being a catalyst, which rang familiar from the Farseer trilogy. And there was also a discussion about a pale woman, which I found so interesting. This other prophet, this other person who thinks that they are the white prophet, whereas the Fool knows that he is the white prophet. There was also discussion about how the pale woman believes that Cabal Rawbread, and such an interesting name, that Cabal Rawbread is her catalyst, but not to enable heroes, but to dismantle them, to disempower men, to make all end before it can begin. Where I would unite, she would divide. Fool, of course, wants Fitz to accompany him back to Buckkeep, and Night Eyes agrees, and I thought that was pretty powerful, but Fitz stays for Hap, That's his excuse. Fitz secretly blames the fool for coming and reminding him how much he missed him. I loved this line so much. I would have continued to pine for the past, but I would not have begun to long for the future. Oh, what a line. So bittersweet, so beautiful, so poignant. And then I was happy because Fitz and the Fool didn't have to part long. Hap returns dismayed about the work situation, the struggles that he's gone through, and Fitz decides that he will go on to Buckkeep for a loan. But a mute person, somebody that Shade has sent, ends up summoning Fitz to court. And Fitz knows that this is a serious matter if he's being summoned by Shade. So he ends up going in secret to Buckkeep. He gets into the castle and everything. Oh my gosh. Secret passages in castles might be one of my favorite things in fantasy. Secret passages in castles, even in mansions or houses. I love a good secret passage, and it seems like Buckkeep is full of them, and I love the stories about these secret passages. Have to say that as a side note. Fitz learns a few things. He learns that Prince Dutiful is missing and that he's witted with a hunting cat as his companion there. They've shared skill dreams in the past before, which makes me wonder if that dream in the first part of the story was actually of Dutiful's dream. And at the same time, as he has concerns about the merging of dreams that have happened in the past between him and Dutiful, he also worries about Nettle because he realizes, I've had a skill dream with Nettle. Is she going to be okay? Is something going to happen to her? Are her boundaries too weak? Dutiful is betrothed or to be betrothed, and the ceremony is to happen in the near future. So Fitz is being asked to try to skill dream, to try to bring Dutiful back or to find out where he is. And this is so hard for Fitz to go back into skilling again. But he does succeed. He does succeed in identifying Dutiful. And then I wrote, I am so emotional over this book. And this was getting closer to the halfway point. Just my emotional spewing on the page here. I'm so emotional over this book. And Hobb hasn't written anything melodramatic. No overt action. No one has gotten hurt except Night Eyes with the fishbone scene. And voices have barely been raised. Yet I feel inner turmoil, longing, love, connection, and all the subtle movements in a conversation when boundaries open and close, when memory provides stability as well as the sting. So I think the boundaries have been at the forefront of my mind, and just the subtle exchange between people, the dynamics between these characters. Oh, I love it so much. I love the way she's exploring that so beautifully, mostly through showing it rather than telling about it. I also appreciated the exchange with Shade and how he feels strange to have to remind Shade of Shade's own wisdom about stopping and thinking before taking action so they don't run fast into the wrong direction. Also, the moment when he goes back to meet Jenna and they end up kissing. But before that, when she reveals that she knows about that he's witted, she knows he's witted, and she gives him that necklace. But for a moment, because he realizes she knows, he actually contemplates killing her as part of his assassin training. Interesting how they end up kissing. Fennel and, or I should say the niece comes home right then. But I loved the cat Fennel. So cute, so cute. I love how that cat is just wanting to be petted and also kind of spicy. I also wondered if this cat would be a key to Dutiful at this point, but not really sure. I also really like the line, I'm forever doomed to be a stranger in my own home. Oh, so many powerful lines. And now I'm going to go to just barely past the halfway point and this exchange between Shade and Fitz where they're talking about trying to get Dutiful. And it's the part when Fitz goes through the skill dream to identify where Dutiful is. But it's also the part when Fitz is asking for help with that loan for Hap or that apprenticeship. And Shade is surprised and hurt that Fitz didn't think he could ever ask. He could ever ask for that help. There's this passage here where Shade is also reflecting on how mistrustful Fitz is. And he tries not to take it personally, but I felt in the subtext of this exchange that he did take it personally. He did take it personally that Fitz never could come around to trusting him. But he says something along the lines of how Fitz has always been mistrustful since he was very, very young. He asks Fitz if he's ever been able to trust anyone, and Fitz reflects on how he loved Molly, but he never trusted her with his secrets. And then he thinks about it and he says, the fool, I trust the fool. But then he wonders if that's true. There was almost nothing about me that he didn't know. That was trust, wasn't it? I thought that was such a powerful line, that maybe trust goes deeper than somebody knowing a lot about you, and how delicate trust is. Even if you have it established with someone, there's still going to be challenges there. And I feel like that comes up for Fitz and for Fool. There's a scene when they're in Fool's quarters and Fitz accidentally goes right into his private chamber and sees all the charms and things that Fool was trying to keep private. And the exchange there was such that Fool was trying not to feel like he should keep all this a secret from Fitz, because he went to Fitz's home. He saw all of Fitz's things. He went through Fitz's scrolls when he was at the cottage, and Fitz didn't stop him. He didn't deny the Fool from that. But here we have a moment where Fitz is intervening in a place where the Fool doesn't feel comfortable, and that's enough for Fitz. He doesn't want to cross that boundary. Now I'll briefly talk about Laurel, who's a new character that we interact with. And the exchange there, again, this little tug of war, this little push and pull between them, trying to know how much they could trust one another. That comes up between the two of them. And I also appreciated the scene when Night Eyes comes up to Fitz and has a heart-to-heart with him. One, it was a hilarious scene because Night Eyes shows up and Fitz says, "Oh, my dog," and then has to pretend, "Oh no, that's a wolf that looks kind of like my dog." And then Night Eyes saunters off, and Laurel is wondering what the heck that was about, how strange it was for a wolf to act like that. But in addition to that, I loved the heartfelt exchange between Night Eyes and Fitz. It seems like there's been some distancing that's happened between Fitz and Night Eyes ever since the fishbone incident. Night Eyes has been recovering. He's been trying to get back his strength, but Fitz is all too aware that Night Eyes is aging, that Night Eyes isn't going to live forever. And I think there's some pre-grieving that's happening in Fitz, and that's why he's distancing himself. At the same time, Night Eyes isn't here for that. And I love this line where he says, "You steal the now of my life away when you constantly fear that tomorrow will bring my death." Oh, what a powerful line, because I feel like pre-grieving is something that can be explored when it comes to somebody fearing the loss of somebody. And I think that's important. It's important to be open to pre-grieving. I think that's a natural aspect of grieving that we maybe don't talk about a lot. I don't know that we talk a lot about grieving in general in our society, but then there's this exploration of what is it like to be the one who is being pre-grieved for? Like if you're the target of the pre-grieving, how uncomfortable that would be. So I felt for Night Eyes in that moment. I felt for both Fitz and for Night Eyes in that moment. And I also just love this idea of like, you're robbing me of this moment with you. I'm not dead yet. We need to be here now. Oh, so beautifully done. So I'm going to come back and update more thoughts in the near future, and I'll do my best to be better about updates. Hobb hates cats. That's what I've learned since the last update. So I am now on chapter 24, which means I only have a little ways to go left in the book. I might do one more update, or I might just update when I finish the book. So some things to talk about. There's a lot to share because the story has progressed and things are happening in a very climactic way right now. First of all, I will say that I feel that the epigraphs are so interesting. They are adding not only foreshadowing elements, but also just connecting perfectly into the story, into the plot. So what I'll say about that is the first one that stood out to me in this half of the story is the one about the Piebalds themselves, and about how the Piebalds will do anything to seize power. They will betray their own kind in order to seize power. While I realize Fitz is the one who is writing these epigraphs and that his reliability has to be put into question at times, it's interesting to consider this about the Piebalds, and then also consider how they view him, how many of them judge him for being willing to turn dutiful in while he himself is witted, to turn one in of his own kind, to betray his own kind. They look at him so critically about that, so it seems like they do have a certain loyalty amongst themselves, at least as they are portrayed in the story, but that's not exactly how they are described in that epigraph. Another epigraph that stood out is the one, I want to say, in chapter 20. So this is the one that has to do with torture. It says here, Versailles' uses of pain. Once a man has been broken by pain, he remains forever a victim. It is a shame no man can recover from. Some try to drown it by becoming the perpetrator of similar pain and creating a new victim to bear for them that shame. Cruelty is a skill taught not only by example, but by experience of it. And then we go into the chapter where they capture the young archer, and Fitz is ruthless with this young boy. He is quite callous and harsh and cruel, to the point where he scares Fool and he scares Night Eyes. And Night Eyes has to pull him back. Night Eyes has to say, no, brother, you don't want to do this. So interesting coming from a wolf. There is conversation later on in the story, and actually earlier in this book, about how the mingling of consciousness between Fitz and Night Eyes has forever changed both of them. And so Night Eyes doesn't exactly think like a wolf. And I think that was helpful, because otherwise I would have a hard time believing a wolf would have that much of an ethical dilemma with what was occurring. But it made sense because of the way it was set up. Ooh, I appreciated this part of the story. It was uncomfortable to see that side of Fitz, but it really does speak to the cyclical nature of abuse and trauma, and also this reflective mirror aspect to the story of how Fitz is seeing something of his younger self, I suppose, in this younger guy. And that comes up again later too, I think, when he meets Dutiful. But that was a pretty profound section, and said a lot about Fitz, about the woundedness there. While it was uncomfortable to see, and I do appreciate Laurel's perspective in the story as an outsider, not knowing Fitz, not knowing his past, and how she sees him. She sees him as a total monster, and she's already very much against the witted magic to begin with, but it just brought something to the story, I think, to see this outsider perspective of Fitz and what's going on there. I did appreciate that. Of course, she escapes with the young archer, and I fully expected, with where I am now, I fully expected her to intervene and save them when the Piebalds surrounded Fitz and the Fool and Night Eyes, and when they had Dutiful captive. I fully expected her to come out and save them in that moment, but it didn't happen. Regardless, she's an interesting character, and it was interesting to learn about how there are mysteries to her past that she is not revealing. There was a line that said, untruth hung almost palpably between us, meaning that she's hiding certain things from him. And she certainly has far more connection with the witted than she's revealing as well. And then another epigraph to mention, I think I accidentally skipped this one, is the one about the Red Ship Wars and how that affected the coastal duchies, how it affected the lesser nobles, how they benefited from that. They benefited from the war, whereas those who were higher nobles maybe suffered a little bit. So there was an interesting exchange of power, and this is how Lady Brazinga ended up in the place she ended up, and how she ended up taking over the household. She married a widower who was a higher noble. He ends up dying, and then she brings all the felines into this household. And it is quite mysterious what's going on with this mist cat, and who gifted this mist cat to Dutiful. What is this consciousness that is within the mist cat? And they decide that it's a dead woman. But is it a woman? That's the question I have, because there was a skill scene, a skill realm scene, in which Fitz hears a voice mocking humans, being critical of humans. And it made me think, ooh, is it a dragon? And then he hears the voice of that's clearly the woman that's trapped inside the cat and mingled with Dutiful. So it made me question if that's the same voice or a different voice, and if this woman is in fact a dragon, or if it is a woman. So many mysteries there that I have not yet solved or not yet read about. And then what else to say? Okay, there's a lot to say about Night Eyes, because Night Eyes is like the hero of the story. Night Eyes has sacrificed so much in this story. He's quite old, he's struggling, and he goes out there when Fitz isn't able to. He goes and he hunts down and finds Dutiful and the Piebalds. He ends up getting attacked by the cat. He has these wounds that are festering, and he still carries on. And not only that, but he does a lot of investigative work too. He's the one who brings to Fitz's attention that the mist cat is strange, that there's something very strange happening. And he's also the one who's able to figure out that there's this interesting intermingling bridge between the witted magic and the skill magic, that when you make a connection with the skill, it allows the witted magic to come through, and that there's just some kind of interesting magical bridge and bleed through that happens with these magics intermingling. And he's also the one who keeps Fitz going. He tells Fitz at one point, be a wolf. As long as there is a cub, there is pack. Go on without me. Whenever Fitz takes Dutiful to the pillar. And it's clear that Fitz feels guilty. He feels guilty about all that Night Eyes is sacrificing and doing out of pure love for him. And I think that's the interesting thing in the story for me, is that I feel as though Fitz is not emotionally motivated by his connection with Dutiful. He doesn't feel this fatherly bond with Dutiful. And I appreciate that choice, because I think it would have been really easy to say something, or superficial, I would say, to suggest that just because their eyes meet and they see that they look like each other, or that there's some resemblance there because of the bond of blood, that they'll instantly have this father-son connection. And that is not what happens. There is an extremely contentious relationship between Fitz and Dutiful. And then he leaves Night Eyes in the Fold to die while he tries to save Dutiful. And Dutiful doesn't want to come. He wants to be with this woman who is manipulating him. And it seems so obvious. That's part of it, I think. But the other thing is that I think that Fitz is motivated by those he does love and that he feels a bond with. And that's why I feel like this story is so perfectly executed in terms of building up from the beginning of the book, and even coming from the Farseer trilogy. Because as much as Fitz suffers before this book begins and during this book, there are such profound moments of love and connection. The moment that he reunited with the Fool, and the moment that he started connecting again to Shade, that was the harder relationship. There are grayer tones there, but there's still a connection there. And even the familiarity he sees in Ketrikin's eyes, and the connection he feels with her, that hasn't waned despite all the years that have passed between them. So I feel like his true love for these people that have been meaningful in his life, for Ketrikin, for Shade, for the Fool, and for Hap, also thinking about Hap's well-being, and Night Eyes too, and for Nettle, I should mention. Even though he hasn't met Nettle, he has seen her from a distance, and he has been in a witted dream with her. Even though he's been in a witted dream with Dutiful, he still feels a deeper connection to Nettle. Either way, I think that there's truly love that's motivating Fitz to do what he does. And as much as this story, like I said, it depicts trauma, it depicts a life lived in shadow and so much sadness, there is love. There is true connection in some of these interactions. And that's what's motivating Fitz. But it's not Dutiful that's motivating Fitz. And I think that there is some bitterness and resentment about that. And I bring all this up too because I think it's interesting, the scene with the young archer, and how the archer is trying to tell Fitz that he is actually being a traitor to his kind. He's being a traitor to Dutiful, who escaped willingly, that he's betraying his prince by trying to bring him back to Buckkeep. But in Fitz's mind, it's the Piebalds who are doing a disservice to the prince and manipulating him and using this miscat in a dangerous way. And in his mind, he sees it as being loyal to Buckkeep, or loyal to the Farseer line, by bringing the prince back. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I love the wisdom that Night Eyes provides to Fitz. Fitz learns the importance of being in the now. That is wolf consciousness, is to be in the now. Don't pre-grieve your loss if it robs you of today. There's also a line that I loved that says, "For self is not the only boundary we set to how we experience being." I love that line because I just love explorations of self. And again, that goes back into boundaries, which I said I felt like was coming up in a large way throughout this book, throughout this series, really. I feel like boundaries are explored in a meaningful way. But also it's bittersweet because we know Night Eyes is coming towards an end. I sense that. I might have even been spoiled for that because so many people have talked about how sad they were about this book because of something. So I'm expecting that to happen. I'm not looking forward to it. It's so beautifully written about being in the now. And it does remind me of the original Farseer trilogy, because there were some lines in that trilogy that that made me think about that as well, I remember. So that's what I have for now. I'll catch you all in the next update. All right, I have finished Fool's Errand, and the first thing I have to say is rip Night Eyes. Of course, I knew that was coming, and it was heavily signaled throughout the book. I did not expect the Mist Cat to sacrifice itself. That was a bit of a surprise, and I had the immediate thought, oh wow, Fitz and Dutiful are probably going to be grieving alongside each other, and that did seem to be the case. Now, I have to say that I had a shift in how I felt about Fitz, specifically when we get to the Treasure Beach scene between Fitz and Dutiful. Fitz is cruel, abusive, callous towards Dutiful, and I felt like it went a bit far for me. I felt very unsettled by it, and I get it. Fitz himself was abused, as we saw even in as far back as Assassin's Apprentice, and we know that there's a cyclical nature to that abuse, as that was explained even in the epigraph in chapter, I don't remember what chapter 20 or some chapter earlier. And I get it. Fitz is a broken man. That is more than clear. It was even clear in the original Farseer trilogy, but I did feel like it went pretty far for me in that particular scene. It's not that Fitz is a sociopath. It's not that he lacks empathy, but towards Dutiful, he truly does not care. He truly feels that it would be fine if Dutiful died. It would be fine to possibly even kill Dutiful. In fact, he asserts that that is the right course of action at one point. He has the knife up to Dutiful's throat. And I had an issue with that too. I thought, Fitz, why? I mean, if somebody has a parasite, would you immediately want to kill that person? Wouldn't you want to try your best to see if that parasite can be removed? So I had a hard time believing that Dutiful was hopeless when Fitz thought Dutiful was hopeless. And so I did have a struggle with that up until that point, I should say, and I don't know what this means about me, because as I said, Fitz is a broken character, and this is something we've known for a long time. I don't know what it says about me, but I felt connected to Fitz. I felt very connected to Fitz all the way up until that scene. And then I thought, okay, this is where Fitz and I divide. It was hard for me to relate to Fitz. It did make me feel distanced from Fitz at that point. I do wonder if maybe the anger that's coming forth in Fitz, this is the way I'm trying to understand it, maybe that anger that is being directed towards Dutiful is part of Fitz's pre-grieving of Night Eyes. I do feel like it's connected to his grief with Night Eyes. And we know that grief, the stages of grief, they're not linear. They're not the same for everyone. But that said, and I'm not saying I necessarily condone it by any means. I don't even think Robin Hobb condones the way that this character is acting towards this character. I'm not saying that at all. But anger is a very normal way to process grief. And I feel that because Fitz feels so out of control and so upset about the situation with Night Eyes, he is perhaps taking that out on Dutiful. But it is so unfair. I had such a hard time with it. And then it was also hard for me to understand Dutiful being okay with this, in the sense that, oh, this is somebody who's not treating me like a prince. Yeah, but that was still pretty far. And yet they're bonded because of that skill bonding situation that happens. There were some interesting passages towards the end about that. It seems like their connection is now forged, and I shouldn't use the word forged in this series because that's confusing, but it's now reinforced by the fact that they are both bonded through the skill and the wit. I think both and Fitz explains this towards the end of the book by saying that the wit, losing their companions through the wit, make them wide open, and it makes them vulnerable or more susceptible to wanting to reach out and to feel that connection for their creatures that are not there. But it spins a wide web in which they're reaching out and radiating that sense of need and perhaps loneliness. And additionally, there is that skill connection that Fitz created with Dutiful, and he finds that it only grows stronger when he looks at it or when he engages with it in any way. And he finds he has no idea how to sever that connection or if it can be severed. So that leads me to think we're going to get a lot more between Fitz and Dutiful in future books, probably more to try and reconcile the situation. But It was difficult. It was difficult for me to get behind what Fitz was doing in those scenes. I did appreciate that Dutiful was receptive to Fitz when Fitz explained the situation about this dead conscious woman who is embodying the Mist Cat, which we later find out more about. I guess I was wrong in my assumption that this could be a dragon because it turns out it wasn't. It turned out to be, what was the name of the character? Paladine, who turned out to be the Piebald's twin sister, Loudwine, however you say his name. So it turns out that she was dead inside the Mist Cat, and that this was all part of the plot of the Piebalds. And so Dutiful finds out he was twice betrayed, if you want to think of it that way, once by Paladine and then also by the Piebalds. And poor Guy, because as Fitz notes here, he wants to be loved in a familiar, unfearing way. He wants to be loved in a way that's not just as a prince or somebody to be feared again as a prince or revered as a prince. At the same time, I also wrote as a note to myself, and Fitz, he also doesn't have a father figure. Of course, that's something that he and Fitz have in common. It seems like he wants that, though. I mean, he has shade, like Fitz had shade, but I think he wants something deeper than that. And so there is that yearning in Dutiful. But back to the beach scene, Dutiful trips on a gold chain, which is connected to a figurine. And the figurine is described as having painted black hair and one of the breasts showing golden skin because of the material. But it also says that the hair has a standing blue ornament crowning it and that she is quite beautiful. Of course, I immediately thought of Malta. But then later on, when we find out about his betrothed, the 11-year-old girl, it seems like she is wearing something similar on her head. And I wonder if this figurine is a good omen for their marriage. I know that Fitz is pessimistic about the marriage, that the best they can hope for is not to hate each other. But I wonder otherwise. I wonder if this figurine is going to change that in any way. I'm still trying to figure out how the magic works when it comes to these objects. I do wonder, however, if it might turn out in Dutiful's favor. Then they get, of course, confronted on the beach and they have to escape. I'm going to skip ahead, though, because I have to take back what I said before about Hobb hating cats. I was, of course, half joking when I said that, but I think she made it more than clear that she doesn't hate cats, especially with the Mist Cat being a victim in all this. I think that was made more than clear. Also, as I already mentioned, I think being a sacrifice in this situation. And I still love Fennel, by the way. I think Fennel is hilarious. Very interesting about Laurel. We learned that she turns out to be cousins with Deerkin, and that she was brought up among the Witted, but she herself doesn't have the magic. I think there was enough earlier to suggest that. However, I still wonder if there's more to her. I still suspect there's more to her character, and I feel like there are hints of that towards the end of the book. I could be off. Maybe I'm reading too far into it. Fitz is skeptical about Deerkin being as innocent as he proclaims to be. And then the other character, the other piebald, well, some of the piebalds get away, but Fitz hacks off the arm of one of the piebalds, Loudwine, that leader. And it seems like he's probably going to come back for Fitz at some point. So we're probably going to see him again in the trilogy or in the series, I imagine. And everyone knows that Dutiful is witted. And so this is going to be a really challenging situation moving forward. That seems to be the least of their problems, though, when you're dealing with grief on the level that Fitz is dealing with it, and even Dutiful. It is interesting how it differs in a way, because for Dutiful, he's young and he didn't even know the Mist Cat's name. And with Fitz, he had this long time span with Night Eyes, long bond with him, and the passing was far more peaceful. It was the right time for Night Eyes to go. Whereas for Dutiful, the Mist Cat's death was violent, even though the Mist Cat asked for it. Dutiful asks Fitz if it ever goes away. Is that the right question? Does it go away? And he says no. The hard realities of grief. Grief is so difficult. I once heard the singer Regina Spektor talk about grief like a basement to your house. Like if your life is a house, when you grieve something, it's like you create a whole new floor, a whole new basement. And you might not stay down there all the time. Like you might not wallow in your grief the rest of your life, but it's always there. And you might go down there sometimes and be there. And I loved that. I loved that description, because I feel like you are forever changed when you grieve somebody or when you grieve someone. And so that seems to be very clearly stated here. I think it's very powerful the way grief is depicted. I'm going to circle back to the theme of boundaries. As I mentioned, I feel like it is prevalent throughout this series, or prevalent throughout this book especially. But in addition to the connection forming between Dutiful and Fitz, I also appreciate the boundaries that Fitz sets. He set one earlier with Starling at the beginning of this book, but I love that he reinstated that boundary when she tries to comfort him. And of course, she takes offense to the fact that he's not going to take her up on her offer. She's so selfish. She sees him as a pitiful, tragic person, especially not knowing that Lord Golden, is the fool. She believes that Fitz is taking on this role as the servant of Lord Golden because he's so pathetic and has nothing else to live for. Little does she know, he also asserts a boundary with Shade. I love that line. He says here, "The prince will decide what I am to him, but I will never again report to you." Shade is happy about this, and there's this reminder about the cruel test that he and the king placed on Fitz at a young age to prove his loyalty to the king over Shade. One more thing I noticed with Fitz is not only his loneliness and his desire for connection and his challenge with trust, but related to that is his desire for anonymity. I feel like that comes up quite a bit. I hate saying that word, by the way, anonymity. I hope I'm saying it right. But that desire to be among people but not be recognized, that seems to come up in the line, "I would have been the greatest fool in the world to regret that I walked unknown amongst such gaiety." I feel like he doesn't care. He doesn't care if people recognize him. He doesn't care about fame. He doesn't care about having the finest clothes that Lord Golden wants him to wear. When he's with Jenna, he has no desire to share about his past, but he wants connection. He doesn't want to be isolated, is the impression I get. And when he was in the woods, Night Eyes was what kept him grounded. I don't know that he's going to go back to that hut, but I guess I'll find out about that. And lastly, I'll say I loved the epigraph, or I love the epilogue, I should say, and the line about how he was trying to fix history by writing it down, and that history is no more fixed and dead than the future. The past is no further away than the last breath you took. That was excellent. I love that. I feel like I could relate to that as somebody who's been a journaler my entire life. I have gotten out of the habit of daily journaling. I might go back to some form of it. I've done a lot of different types of journaling and creative journaling, and now I do reading journals. But I know that when I've done more emotional processing through journaling, I did find that I was trying to fix things, and it worked. I think it did help me in a self-help kind of way for many years, but I got to a point where it didn't quite do that anymore. Sometimes you have to let things be, let the past breathe as it is and let it go. And there's something to be said about the way she talked. My camera died in the last clip, so I'm finishing out the vlog here. And first of all, I'll go ahead and say that this was a phenomenal read. I had to fight expectations because this book was so hyped for me. When I did a video a month or two back comparing the Farseer trilogy with Live Ship Traders, I received quite a few comments talking about how Tawny Man and Fool's Errand was better than all that came before. So I knew that this was a very beloved book. And I did question at the beginning whether this was going to affect me on the level that it affected others. And I found it did. I found with each page I turned, it seemed to seep deeper and deeper into me in the most profound, slow burn way. That said, I do have a hot take, which is that the first half of the book hit me emotionally harder than the second half. And it's not that I didn't care about Night Eyes dying, I certainly did, but I think the reason why is because, well, a couple of reasons. One is that I knew that Night Eyes, his death was coming, and maybe because I knew it was coming, I was tuned into the theme of pre-grief that occurred throughout the book. So because I was pre-grieving that happening, it didn't quite feel like quite a blow or shock to me when it did happen, but I still think it was beautifully written. And it was something that made me emotional, reflecting on how my dog passed away a year ago, almost a year ago now. Interesting timing there. And I also additionally loved the exploration of sacrifice, duty, loyalty, boundaries, as I talked about many times throughout the vlog, and the dance of boundaries and trust when people are either getting to know each other or they've had a long established connection, and then how that's related to the magic of the story. I love the way that Hobb explored those themes, and I do look forward to reading on in this series. I left off feeling a little bit differently about Fitz by the end than I did at the beginning, but I know that he's a broken person. I think that's always been clear, especially since the Farseer trilogy. And I am curious to see what develops between him and Dutiful moving forward. So those are my thoughts on Fool's Errand for now. Please let me know in the comment section below if there's any theme that you tuned into that you want to talk about, or any thoughts on the thoughts I shared. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.